Hello, everyone. Familiar faces, and thanks for joining us today again for the seminar series. And today we have Dr. Shinki and Dr. Gonzalo joining us to talk about one of the purposes of tertiary education and unpacking the diverse perspectives and politics in England. I'm not going to go into depth of the research itself, but without further ado, I hand over to Shin and Gonzalo. I think we're gonna maybe talk for 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll spend the rest of the time getting questions and feedback from the room and also online.
Can you just check the
Oh, can you hear us online, right? Can you give us a signal?
Yes, it's fine.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you everyone for joining us today in person and online. Maybe we'll start with a bit of self-introduction, Gonzalo.
Yeah, I'm Gonzalo Hidalgo Bazan. I'm a postdoctoral researcher in SKOPE, and I'm working with Shin in the project that we are going to present soon on tertiary education policy in England.
Thank you. And hi everyone, I'm Xin Xu. You can call me Xin. I'm a departmental lecturer in higher and tertiary education and also the deputy director of the SKOPE Research Center. So today we're going to talk about an ongoing work in progress paper around the purposes and the politics around the purposes of tertiary education in England. It will draw on, as mentioned, the ongoing work paper we're developing, also with James, as well as another paper we've just finished and submitted. It's under review, which was an integrative literature review around the research in the past 30 years, focusing on collaboration and competition in tertiary education in England. As for the kind of the flow of our presentation today, we'll give you a bit of a context about the research as well around the LSE landscape and discussions around the purposes of higher education, further education, tertiary education, and critics from the scholarly perspective, then the research questions as well as methodologies. In terms of findings, we'll present with you a typology of the purposes of tertiary education that's being discussed from the stakeholder interviews, as well as some aspects of the political and politics of defining the purposes. We'll conclude with some reflections and discussions around why this is important, why it's important to talk about the purposes, and then more importantly, maybe how and possible pathways for creating shared purposes within the very diversified sector. And then just to give you a bit of an overview of the project where the paper draws from. The project itself looks at the system thinking approaches to tertiary education policy making in England. It explores the challenges, opportunities, and tensions around a system thinking within the England's tertiary education landscape. And then we have conducted, as mentioned, comprehensive literature review around relevant literature, as well as 7 workshops with policymakers, with learners, with different stakeholders, and also in collaboration with a wide range of colleagues. We've also conducted over 26 individual interviews, again, with the different stakeholders. Some of the stakeholders have roles in the national policy sectors, governments, or organizations, and some of them have institutional leadership roles, and some of them are from a very specific region in England that is the Northeast region, because we understand tertiary education from both kind of a national coordination perspective, but also highlighting the regional differences and regional specialities. We thank all the participants for offering their valuable time and insights, and the project is funded by the John Falk Fund. Here at Oxford, we are in the final writing up stage, and hopefully we'll publish the report in April this year. And then before we move to talk about the purposes of tertiary education, just a bit of the conceptual unpacking about the term tertiary itself, which has been discussed quite a lot in the previous sessions of this seminar series. So I'll give you a very brief overview for those who might not yet have been familiar with the term. So the tertiary education can be understood from 2 perspectives. One is more descriptive, which is used in, say, international organizations like OECD, UNESCO, etc., to describe the post-secondary education pathways in general. But then here in our project, as well as with other colleagues, we argue that tertiary education should be considered as a more political framing and political term that highlights the joined up aspects, the coherence aspect, as well as the synergies across higher education, further education, and other education and training providers, as well as synergies across tertiary education, as well as research and innovation. We highlight that to foster tertiary education system, it will also help and serve all learners despite their ages. Because if we highlight only the, for instance, higher education, it will be targeting at people with the population at certain age groups. However, the tertiary education will be open to learners across their lifetime. And then the tertiary education landscape in England is quite complicated. It's a massive sector with more than 450-ish educational providers, higher education providers, more than 150-ish for the education colleges, and more than 1,300-ish apprenticeship organizations. It's also very much fragmented between with silos that are persistent between higher education, further education, and other training providers, etc. And then it's also complex pathways for learners to navigate, which has been reflected in many of the previous literature when learners found it difficult to try to imagine themselves in going through the different pathways or transitioning across the different pathways. It's also a very typical quasi-market system, which has also been discussed a lot in the previous sessions of this SKOPE Seminar Series, where different educational providers within the system really need to compete for resources, for reputations, and most importantly, compete for students. Because the sector here in England has been characterized with the neoliberal framing from the policy and from the realities for a long time, where the students are positioned as consumers and their choices matter a lot for the institutions. But we're also seeing the policy divergence of the moves towards more coherent joined up tertiary education systems in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and here in England. There have been a lot of scholarly discussions around the moves towards the tertiary education systems that recognize the interdependence across the sector, that highlights that there should be joint decision making around certain social priorities and around social allocations, and also highlight that the tertiary education will provide more inclusive pathways for learners, etc. And those discussions, some of them are more recent, but some of the discussions in England happened in the late 1990s as well. So the discussions are not always as new. However, in terms of policy momentum, we're seeing more of the policy momentum towards a more joined up or coherent approaches. Some of the examples include, for instance, in the paper around Skills England, DFE has highlighted that higher education and further education systems must be brought closer together. And then in the post-16 Education and Skills white paper published last October, it was also proposed that there should be a single regulator for all higher education providers, there should be unified funding modules, and then there should be a shift from markets towards a system, whereas system, the term itself, has been emphasized over 130-ish times, which was also talked about in one of the previous sessions of the seminar series. So that's the broader landscape of the tertiary education in England. But then what are the purposes? So for the dominant education providers within the tertiary education landscape, there's the higher education sector and the further education sector. So we'll be firstly unpacking some of the existing discussions from the scholarly perspectives. So what is education for? Education for what? And also importantly, for whom? In terms of the purposes of higher education, traditionally, it has been characterized into intrinsic purposes as well as extrinsic purposes. To unpack this a bit further, let's time travel a little bit to thousands of years ago, as well as zoom out of the England cases and travel a bit across the world. So the intrinsic purposes across the world and traditionally have been centering on the idea that higher education will provide opportunity for people to form themselves through culturally, intellectually, and then the activities that are important to this formation are teaching and learning, as well as the knowledge and scholarship and research. And many will argue that knowledge, scholarship, and research are the things that distinguish higher education from other sectors within the society. And then these traditions or understandings of the functions, its intrinsic values and purposes of higher education have been rooted in lots of contexts, including Confucian learning in the traditional Chinese context, the Buddhist monastic communities in India, in the Academy of Athens, and the scholarly traditions of medieval Islam and Europe. We're also seeing those discussions from, for instance, the Newman's idea of a university and other thinkers like Kant, Humboldt, and Dewey, etc., across the world. So those shape kind of the more traditional understandings of the purposes of higher education. However, there's also the extrinsic side of higher education, which are grounded in the knowledge aspect, but also expands beyond it and need to collaborate and engage with the wider society and wider sectors. And that have a wide range of arrays. For instance, it can be higher education are considered to prepare students for work, for cultivating responsible citizens, for the societies, either as national citizen or global citizen. There's also the contribution to the social equality through higher education. However, the question of has higher education being able to foster more social equity is a question mark in many of the research. Then there's also the contribution to economic growth, which is very much highlighted more and more in the policy discourses. There's also the contribution to policy and nation building, and in some context, contribution to modernization of the country. There's also the cross-border relationship building through student mobility, partnership building, and research collaboration, etc. Also, importantly and broadly, the contributions of higher education to peace, to sustainability, to the humankind, etc. So all of those extrinsic purposes are increasingly getting more and more highlighted. And then within the scholarly research, we're also seeing the terms around multiversity, which moves beyond university to describe the multiple purposes of the universities, as well as the triple helix models, which connect universities with more entrepreneurship and also industry and innovation activities, etc. So those are highlighted. Also, there's also other strands of kind of traditions and thinkings around, for instance, Ubuntu philosophies that highlight higher education could be contributing to foster more understandings around the interconnectedness of humankind across the world. The extrinsic and intrinsic purposes are not always in conflict or in tension. For instance, if we look at Biesta's three functions of higher education, namely qualification, socialization, and subjectification, it manifests a combination of kind of the intrinsic and extrinsic purposes of higher education. And then within higher education sector, the purposes are also stratified across institutions. Some institutions are expected to shoulder more of certain types of purposes. For instance, when we talk about global connection, then some of the universities will have higher global standings and more resources that are more equipped for them to shoulder such kind of responsibilities. And then purposes of knowledge creation, research conduction are more associated with the research-intensive universities, etc. But then in general, and if we travel back here to England today, to England's higher education sector today, we've been seeing a very dominant discourses and discussions around the economic and neoliberal framing of the purposes, which are very much extrinsically focused, and then sidelining some other purposes of higher education, which Gonzalo will unpack a bit more with the critiques and discussions of that. And then move towards the further education sector. So when talking about the purposes of further education, some of these discussions have been focusing on how it complements the higher education sector in terms of, and it's been highly or traditionally strongly associated with the work, job and employment discussions and agenda. There's also like within England, it was also traditionally kind of framed or initiated as split from the classical curriculum, which is not exactly the same case in France or Germany. However, that separation continued in the siloed way of understanding of further education here today. Another important role or important purposes of further education has been to foster widening participation, to provide opportunities for more learners to enter the post-secondary education. And then there's also the regional contribution aspect that's been discussed a lot around further education's purposes, because further education FE colleges are considered to be more adaptive, or to be able to be more adaptive to the local and regional needs and opportunities. However, there are more. Scholars like Lisa and Gavin have been arguing that the educational purposes are beyond the skills, and then we should also be looking at the capabilities of the students, of the learners, and how further education also helps students in their transformations. There's also discussions around how further education is also provides the space for learners to engage with learning beyond credentials and across all age groups. So it's not only education for a job, but education for life. And that brings us to the questions about the purposes of tertiary education, because I presented kind of the multiple and sometimes conflicting purposes around within higher education and within further education sectors themselves already. But when we try to bring everything together in a tertiary umbrella, are we seeing things to converge? Are we seeing some of the purposes take more dominant roles? Are we seeing, for instance, some of the purposes of higher education being imposed to further education, or the other way around? So with these questions, I will hand over to Gonzalo.
Thank you, Shin. So in our discussion during the previous weeks, we have discussed a lot about the white paper, the post-16 white paper, and we see a very dominant policy narrative on the purpose of tertiary education, which is mainly focused on economic growth, productivity, and employment outcomes, which is very explicit and direct on the emphasis and of the government. But this is also reflected in the fact that there are several concepts that are absent in the discussion of the white paper. For example, equity, equality are not present or are just once in the document, and is referring only to equality of opportunity. Widening participation also once, and other ideas that suggest a deeper commitment with social transformations, such as social justice, is not present in the document. And this is particularly surprising because there are some initiatives that I think could help in order to advance toward a more fair tertiary education system in that particular document. So there is a decision to frame this discussion in these economic terms. But this economistic framing is not unique for England. Some weeks ago, there was the publication of the new strategy of tertiary education in New Zealand. New Zealand already have a tertiary education framing, and they discussed that they are going to be focused unapologetically on economic growth, and the new mantra is going to be refocus on the things that really matters. So this is not just England going through this very dominant economistic discussion, What is striking, though, is that the government in New Zealand is a right-wing coalition and is discussing tertiary education in very similar terms than the Labour Party here. So this could suggest that there is some understanding of some ways to talk about policy in tertiary education that are even that transcend political parties and becoming hegemonic and dominant in the policy discussion. But there is a lot and very strong criticism to the economization of the discussion on tertiary education. Simon Marginson and Lily Young show how newer policy reports here in England describe the contribution of higher education just in terms of individualized economic benefit, with contrast with previous policy reports and also with their interview material, which doesn't see the public goods and the private goods as sum zero game. But they also highlight that the lack of consensus around what are the public good outcomes makes very difficult to challenge the idea and the focus on the private benefit of higher education. Paul Ashwin has also been contributing a lot to this discussion, and he argued that this focus on the purpose of higher education mainly in terms of employability also undermines the proper discussion of the educational purpose of higher education, which should be more related with the transformative engagement with knowledge or some bodies of knowledge. He also stressed that the focus of we need to focus more in the educational purpose of the entire higher education system and not just universities. And he shows how there is attention in reviewing different journal publications in the journal Higher Education, how there is attention between higher education for critical agency, more connected with the transformative power of education, and a focus on a skilled workforce, which is more connected with a reproductive understanding of education. And of course, as Shin already mentioned, the work of Lisa and Gavin is being very important in order to challenge what they call the skills fetish or the skills discourse that is being dominating this discussion. And they describe the skills as a doxa, as an unquestionable, undisputed truth, and how this focus can also reduce the purpose of education to skill supplies for the labor market. This critical perspective go even further, and there is other people that is also highlighting that there is a lack of a moral compass guiding the advancement and the development of the system. This is from a blog post in The Conversation some weeks ago, which is very connected with the idea of Biesta and his description of the global university as lacking internal values, which make the university and education providers very adaptive to private and external interests rather than serving the public good and the self-defined purpose of the educational system. So all this criticism gives an account of the dominant character of a utilitarian and very instrumental ways in order to understand the tertiary education system and what are its purposes. However, if you go to the more international and comparative literature, or at least a part of it, in the international literature, the discussion on the purposes of tertiary education recognize explicitly their contribution to both economic and non-economic benefits. And there are highlighted very different benefits from tertiary education system, among them gender equality, engaged civil society, the improvement of democracy, public health. So we need to retake a little bit, we argue that we need to retake this discussion on the purpose of higher education and recenter what are the focus of the discussion currently. However, this debate on this criticism remains very normative in the literature. So there is still some space for an empirical examination of how the purpose is envisioned among the different actors within the system. And especially if we are thinking on the tertiary space as a new particular system within the country. So that is the particular space in which we want to contribute. So our research questions are how the purpose of tertiary education is envisioned, discussed, and negotiated among different education actors. And I'm going to describe, but we have a multi-stakeholder approach. And how widespread are these emphasis on economic outcomes among the tertiary education actors? And we are also wanted to focus on what are the dispute or the contestation around the discussion of purposes among these different education actors. Some conceptual tools, we are working with the idea of system, and we understand system as always articulations that are always mission driven, and then there is that particular mission, that particular purpose. We define what are the boundaries of the system and the activities within the system, but also we are understanding the system as different actors that are interconnected and shaped by the spatial and historical context. But however, that interconnection is always unstable, so allows for contestation, dislocation, and evolution and change within the system. We are also working with the idea of hegemony as partially fixed articulation of meaning that can become a social consensus. But because they are partially fixed, they are always open for disruption and contestation. So that is where we want to explore how this economic dominance in one particular level of the system could be very contested in the level of actors. And because of that, the political, we are not understanding the political in the reductive terms of connecting with government and political parties, but as a contestation between different the contestation of different positions in the name of a particular principle or a particular idea. This is our methodology. We have conducted 26 semi-structured interviews with some of our participants were principals of further education colleges and vice chancellors of universities. Many of them were from these mission organizations of further education or higher education associations, civil servants mainly in the Department for Education, a couple of union representatives, people working in local governments, especially in the skills leaders and strategy leaders, people from associations of employers or training providers, and also we had two interviews with students. And we have complemented that that interviews with 5 group interviews with 88 students and learners, and each of these 5 groups were very diverse. So they were students from universities, from further education colleges, and also some learners that were in some short-term training or boot camps or other skills initiatives. And we conducted a thematic analysis looking for patterns around what are the purposes that these different actors identify within the system. So this is our findings we have divided our findings in 2 parts. The first one is this typology of the different purposes that we identify among the education actors, and we have organized them in these 2 axes. The first one, individual and private, and collective and public, and the vertical one, economic and non-economic. And the first one is very aligned with the government agenda and the government and the policy narrative. And there are many people that talks about the purpose of tertiary education in terms of growth and employment. And we have made a distinction with employability, because there are some people, even though they are of course connected, but in the first part, we are discussing employment as an aim for the population and for the nation. And there are other people that discuss employment as something more individual, as people getting the skills in order to be employable. But we make the difference in the different levels in which people discuss this. The third one is we group all the different purposes that are related, that have an individual level but are non-economic, and they are much more related with agency and the flourishing of individuals. And then we have grouped in the fourth purpose all the different ways in which people talk about societal aims. People talk about this in different ways. So public good, social justice, and equity, another concept they use, but they all describe a societal aim that is not economic. And the fifth one, and we put it in the center, is education, and we put it in the center because we want to recognize education as a purpose itself, but also as a purpose that is a first step or is related with the achievement of all the different purposes. And the people is very explicit in order to make those particular connections. And in this next 5 slides, I want to share with you some of the evidence of this typology that we are building. The first one is about economic growth, and there is many people that talks about economic growth in the same terms that the government agenda do. And this quote, the first quote, is a person from an independent provider, from the independent provider sector, and he described the success of his sector as totally related with the success of the economic agenda of the government, and how the success of the independent providers is also the success in terms of growth and productivity. So, and we don't identify some particular kind of factors that is more aligned with this kind of narrative. But the people that talk about economic growth, it comes from different sectors: higher education, further education, and private sector. However, all of them are very aware of the agenda of the government and very willing to be contributing to that particular agenda. This second purpose that is more at the individual level is about employability, and they describe the purpose of education as the way in which people can get the skills and the competences in order to be successful in the labor market. And the second quote is very explicit about that, and he described the purpose of education about us preparing someone to go into work competently, safely, and swiftly as possible, and to retain it. And we have decided to put 2 quotes from a student because this is also one of our findings. Students much more are focused, and the description of purposes are very much focused on employability in the different sectors, higher education and further education. And it seems to be a particular anxiety around employability among students that is also being described in other research. The third purpose is about flourishing and of individuals and agency. And I think the first quote really expressed this idea. He's very direct on that the purpose of education is building agency of the person being educated. And I like this quote because he made a difference and he put it in opposition to the growth agenda of the government. So he say this is much more important than growth. But also he identified the agency and the flourishing of individual as something that can allow other purposes. So as a first step in order to achieve growth. So he say like, I don't think that without agency, if you don't get agency, you don't get growth. And the fourth one is about the public good, social justice, and equity, in which we have been grouping all the different ways in which people talk about societal aims that are not economic. And I think this quote is really reflect the discussion. He is actually discussing about growth, and he say, actually, I think it's about social justice as well. I think that is important. You cannot get away from that. However, he say, social justice is for some reason less shiny, less glamorous, and less exciting to people. So this quote really shows how the discussion is shaping the way in which people consider some particular purposes more attractive and more legit than others. And then our central, the purpose that we place in the center of our taxonomy is educations, and we are understanding education in a very broad terms. Also recognizing there the development of knowledge, skills, but also some other things that like values, for example. And here this person from a higher education mission group, she say like, well, I'm very pragmatic. I think the purpose of higher education is deepen and expand knowledge. However, he started to connect that particular thing with other purposes and other concerns of that she had. For example, she relates the deepen of an expansion of knowledge with the working of democracies, with the concerns about the planet, and also with the individual flourishment of people.
So that's what people have discussed about like their understandings of the different purposes. But then we also understand that the purposes of tertiary education is not only kind of a philosophical or conceptual discussion or normative discussions, it's highly political. The purposes defined are never neutral. So we also asked the question about like how the purposes are defined, by whom, for what. And so there are some emerging findings we'd like to share, but as mentioned, this is work in progress. So any feedback is also very much welcome. So firstly, one of the themes we found is that there's a conflicting understandings about the purposes between the policy framing and with the wider actors within the sector. So as mentioned and discussed, the policy framing has been focusing predominantly around the growth, economic agenda, etc. However, that's been challenged by all of the actors interviewed across different sectors. So for instance, here we have two quotes. One is a senior staff from the government's regulation body, and who's saying that it's fundamental and almost obsession that this is all about economic growth and productivity. And so they're challenging the notion that the policy agenda is too kind of highlighting the economic growth agenda. And then here we also have another CEO from college group who is also suggesting that the FE colleges tend to be stuck in the middle, where the missions and purposes of higher education may be considered broader, but for them, they're saying we are treated in a way that implies that our students are units of economic activity. So the very instrumental and narrowed perspectives are kind of, as they see, trapping them more and maybe more difficult to escape from. And then another kind of emerging finding is that there's also tensions within the government. So because we've interviewed colleagues and senior staff from the Department for Education, DFE, and so there's one quote who is saying that there's a tension between the opportunity and growth mission. And then actually you could change your approach to higher education so that it's much more focused on growth, but actually that would dilute the extent to which it's focused on delivering that opportunity mission. Then we've got another quote from the participant saying that, of course, the benefits of higher education or the purposes of higher education are not just limited to economic benefits, but it's not a view that everyone agrees with. You know, you do get challenged, like the Treasury colleagues are obvious, and that challenge is right. Higher education is funded in part by the taxpayer, and so therefore it's the right that taxpayer gets a return on higher education. But so here is kind of the more internal dynamics and tensions within the policy making spaces as well, which is also perhaps not surprising, but our research hopefully captured some of those internal dynamics. And the third thing is that there's also the tension between the individual values and beliefs versus the contextual environment that one operates in. So the politics and political dimension operates in daily lives. For some of the individual institutional leaders, their beliefs may be in conflict with what the institutions should be having or the norms or the context they operate in. So for instance, the first quote is from a senior staff from the higher education mission group, who's saying that I think that's the environment and institution has a sort of existential need to survive. Therefore, they will take what decisions they need to take, you know, and they are judging a variety of strategic risks. And this speaks to the specific environment where a lot of higher education, further education, tertiary education institutions in general facing the existential crisis nowadays, so which left people and institutions with no choice. Then another perspective from one of the academics interviewed, saying that it feels to me as though financial considerations are dominating any discussion, and with the idea that there's no money. So that's really the key, because it does make a massive difference in terms of how generous you can be in your thinking and what you think you can do. So that's the contextual, and more specifically here in the interviews, the financial constraints have been one of the things that people are finding maybe constraining people in thinking about, understanding, and also imagining what's possible for not only themselves, but also for the sector. And also because in the interview, some individuals have expressed kind of broad understandings about the purposes. However, with the institutions they're leading, or with the sector they're leading, there need to be decisions made that may be in conflict with personal beliefs. And then the fourth group of themes that we found is, as Gonzalo also mentioned, there's a wide range of understandings of the purposes, which tend to be broader than the policy narratives or the narrowing economic purposes across like participants across different institutions. Although understandably, students and actors from the technical and vocational sector tend to focus more around the employment, employability discussions. And then we also found that some of the discussions around purposes are not about the purposes themselves, but more importantly, about the boundaries of tertiary education, about the decision-making powers. So who sets the boundary? Who decide who can be included and not to be included? Who decide whose purposes should be dominant or not? Who decide how the funding and resources are allocated? So those are the things that will be also part of the broader context that are shaping, constraining, or in some cases might be enabling, but in our interviews, it's been mostly in the constraining side of things, of how people understand the purposes. So issues like who coordinate the tertiary system, whether it's the national government, it's the regional government, the combined authorities, or the locals, or the universities within the region, or the ethnic colleges, etc. So those issues also decide whose purposes are considered more important than others, and that could be applied across the sector or not applied across the sector. So we finished with some discussions and reflections, and I'm also conscious of time. Firstly, we argue it's important to take a step back from the policy discussions around the purposes of tertiary education because, one, the policy framing does not always represent the full spectrum of all the possible and purposes of tertiary education that tertiary education should be serving or could be serving. And then if we think about the policy enactment or implementation perspective, it's also important to understand that it does not happen automatically. People interpret policies differently, people practice policies differently. As our research has shown, they have broader understandings about the purposes of tertiary education, so there might be gaps and tensions between that as well. And then we also argue that the moral core that anchors the tertiary education will be important, and the moral core should not be kind of forgotten or buried within only the economic growth agenda, because otherwise the sector risks being very adaptive to whatever changes are being imposed on the sector, whereas there should be some more kind of anchoring to certain types of values that may not be always influenced by the economic conditions or policy discussions and discourses. And also from our research and interviews, we've identified some of the opportunities, which hopefully will end with some positive notes to people, that there are possibilities to move beyond or make frictions within the hegemonic framing and understandings about tertiary education, about how it contributes to economic growth and how the neoliberalism has been dominating the sector. We argue that shared purposes are possible, and it's also been argued across the literature we've reviewed that there are identified shared purposes and principles across higher education and further education and through collaborations. For instance, the educational functions and values, the formation of students themselves, the importance of knowledge, the development and contributions to social, to the common good and public good, etc., etc. So those are also articulated through the research, through the interviews, and understood with some of the actors within the sector. And then, so those may be helping us to imagine the seemingly unimaginable, coming back to the multiple purposes of tertiary education that would center more around the education functions, knowledges, public good, and common good discussions, which hopefully will help us to move a bit away from the narrowed utilitarian instrumental discussions about higher education, which is also part of the discussions about the losing distrust in higher education in a very economic framing of the investment and return ratio discussion. And then also it helps us defend the sector against some of the populist attacks around its value and its purposes. And hopefully it helped to reclaim the public aims of the sector, as well as reassert the ambitions and the educational aims, which is why we are terming them as tertiary education, not tertiary sector, right? So it's the education is the core. So that's our presentation today, and any questions and feedback are most welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane, Gonzalo, and people online. Feel free to drop your question in the chat or raise your hand. But I think I probably just take myself as a chair to the advantage to ask the first question, if you don't mind. I think my question was when you're talking about the stakeholders' perspectives, and those typologies are really useful. But I was very interested in I think one of the quotes Gonzalo mentioned about education and then agency and growth. So agency first and then growth second. I was interested in if any of those stakeholders they said anything about the relationships between the intrinsic or extrinsic values or purposes of higher education, because they don't seem that clear cut, or there's a lot of in between spaces where it can be really good synergies, and economic growth is not fundamentally bad or evil, and it has to be a holistic approach to look at it. So I'm wondering if there's anything that you can explain more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, very good question, because probably I should mention it. Like, this is our scheme and our the way in which we're trying to show the findings is just in order to explain it. But of course, there is when the people talk, they talk about not just one particular purpose. They talk about multiple different purposes. So probably the same people that talk about economic growth is the people that talk about social justice. So of course, there is a lot of relationships, and the people do mention some focus in one particular purposes in order to, as a first step, in order to achieve another purpose. So we are not saying or implying that economic growth is not important. Actually, it is very important. Our point is that it's being very hegemonic and dominant, the discussion in that particular terms, not allowing or overshadowing the discussion on other part of the education system and other aims of the education system that are also important to be discussed.
Thank you for a lovely paper. The research you've done is very nice and extremely helpful, and I really appreciate the extent to which you've been thinking about the data. I'm trying to theorize your findings. I think that's really helpful. And my comment is this, that your research is grounded in your empirical data and your empirical findings, and that's what you're reporting. And sometimes it's helpful to identify the things that are not said as much as the things that are said. And sometimes the things that are not said are just as important as the things that are said. And it seems to me that after decades of individualization and neoliberal reforms, that the way in which we conceive of the individual versus the collective has become a bit thin. It's either individual is this and collective is that. And I'm just wondering whether it would be helpful to draw on the theorists that you had at the beginning of your paper to think about the relationship between the individual and the collective, because I think that if you've got flourishing of the individual and agency in the individual box, then that sort of closes you off to thinking about flourishing at the collective level and what that may entail. And if we just envisage the collective as being about social justice and equity, as important as they are, then we might miss a whole lot of other dimensions that might be just as important, but which were not mentioned by your participants. So concepts such as capacity building in society, in regions and in areas, collective agency, civil society. These seem to be important concepts we can use to think about England's place-based strategic approach. So one possibility would be to think about how we can enrich the concept of the collective when we're thinking about place-based approaches. So going beyond, including social justice and equity, of course, that's foundational, but the collective isn't just about those things. It's about more than that. And I think your theorists that you identified at the beginning are a really good place for you to think about that.
I agree. I think we are very open to review and I think probably our diagram is too fixed and doesn't allow for this movement and this openness between the different sections in our typology. So probably we need to think about how also to include the thing that is not said. We thought about that as well, and how we can place in our diagram the influence of that is external or is not there, but we didn't find a particular solution for this particular presentation. But I totally agree. Like I think we can review with that lens our data. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. Sorry, just to add, that's really, really helpful because when problem with diagrams is that things are always not clear cut. But then we're trying to find a way to kind of conceptualize the different understandings in a way that's meaningful and then maybe also helpful for others to understand that. And I very much agree with you that the collective aspect can be enriched with maybe data outside our interviews. And in the literature that we've reviewed, there's for instance, discussions around collaborations between tertiary education institutions and the communities, where the collective has been discussed quite a lot, not only in terms of social justice, but also from more collective common good understandings. And also there are issues like social reducing poverty, peace, etc., which are important, but not always discussed in interview context.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. You've elaborated very well the strengths of tertiary system as an analytical tool, as I think you mentioned, Gonzalo. But might tertiary education system be something in addition? Might it be a policy tool, at least as a way of organizing policy, but might it be even further an organizational tool? Might regional skills development bodies, whatever they bloody well called, might they not institutionalize tertiary system as an organizational principle as well as an analytical one? And might one not think about the role of tertiary system in these different dimensions?
Yeah, I think the tertiary education has, and I think it's something that we want to discuss as well. It has this structuring nature, which is could be in the policy, but I think it has the power to have another kind of effects in terms of institutions. And I think the discussion on purposes also could be a contribution on how that structuring power of tertiary as a particular way to understand the system could shape the practices at the local level. That's why I think the discussion on purposes is crucial. I'm not sure if I'm responding directly your question.
So when we talk about the purposes of tertiary and how they're interpreted, we're not just talking about purposes of higher education plus purposes of further education. We're talking about the possibilities of thinking beyond a single very simple merges. We're talking about more coherence, collaboration, etc. as in a tertiary framing. Is that what you?
Yeah, well, I think Anne-Marie was referring to that in her various. The country I know best had a tertiary education commission for a decade in the 80s and is now legislating to establish a Australian tertiary education, another commission. Yeah. Now, I'm not suggesting that England's going to go anywhere near that, but using it as an analytical tool is just one long way away from institutionalizing.
Shall we take one question from online?
Yeah.
Helen, do you want to unmute? Ellen, you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks very much. I think I'm kind of following on the back of Gavin's question. My question, I kind of like your quadrant. I'm not sure that I would be quite so comfortable with some of the terminology as to how you've defined the interpretations. And I expect if I looked at the quadrant, the thing that comes to mind to me is that the positions are set up as oppositional. I'm not quite sure that they are oppositional. And if I put on a policy hat, because the question that comes up to me, that comes in mind is how one uses this kind of a tool, which is I think maybe Gavin, you were mentioning it as a policy instrument or a tool. I mean, how does this cross over with the whole discussion about diversity and differentiation? And are there institutions or ways of the system basically crossing over those different boundaries? Indeed, those boundaries are already blurred between all those things. You can be all of those things arguably at the same time. Some institutions might, and it might be interesting to cross-lay that with looking at how different types of institutions cross these different boundaries in different ways or have the greater weight in some than others. I don't know, I'm just thinking about it. But one concern would be is that ends up being reinterpreted as a way of stratifying a system or putting up now very harsh, where mission is very important, mission differentiation. I think that's a really important thing. But on the other hand, what you're also looking at in some of the comments was a much more flexible type of a system and how that might work out. So I guess I'm looking at what you've got and then how one interprets that in terms of what's happening and where institutions or colleges, or just call them institutions, fit across those kinds of different boundaries.
Thank you, Ellen. That's super helpful. So to respond to your question, firstly, in terms of the quadrant, as mentioned, we are still thinking and developing that, and very much agree that a binary positioning is never never ideal or natural, and things are more complex. And then when we were doing the groupings, we're not trying to group institutions into the different quadrants. But then if the institutions were to place down certain quadrants, I agree that it will be occupying multiple spaces simultaneously. But we'll need to come back to the idea about the diagram and then think further around them. Because personally, I'm also not a fan of the binary kind of framing, and that's one of the reasons we have the skills and education at the core, just to say that things are beyond that. And then in terms of how it might be kind of interpreted, I guess that maybe something we can also work further.
Yeah.
Yes.
But I'm totally agree, and thank you for your comment, Ellen. I think that was never our intention in our discussion to present it as oppositional. So we need to work on how we explain and how we diagram these different findings. So thank you.
Yeah, and also on the question around like stratifications or diverse roles that can be assigned to institutions that lock them into certain positions, I agree with you. That's a risk, and that's also something we've been observing within the sector already, where certain types of institutions are categorized of having certain types of responsibilities and purposes, and that's also something I think discussed a bit in the interviews as well. So we may need to unpack that dimension a bit further as well. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you, Ella. We have one question or two, and then we'll come back to you, Zachary, James, and Jonathan.
Okay, first.
Oh, sorry, Andrew.
Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you both for a really interesting presentation and paper. It's great to see that data and sort of really rich discussions coming out from people in the sector. I think that's really important. I want to make sort of two question-like points. I'll try and turn them into questions. The first one is, I think it's really important that you began the presentation by highlighting different understandings and conceptualizations of tertiary education. I think that's really important. And for me, the important definition is the political one. So tertiary, when we talk about tertiary, it's actually a political endeavor to create a integrated system across different pathways, and inherent in that integration is fundamentally complexity. Like, it's a term that actually is a way of enabling us to talk about diverse range of pathways across this whole post-16 space. And I think it's right to emphasize purposes. That's really good, really great thing to pull out of this. But I wonder if the political framing got lost, and some of the discussion actually leads to what we're talking about purposes, but the underpinning complexity of tertiary education is sort of a bit lost, and it just ends up this homogenized thing simply by asking the question around the purposes of tertiary education. Because if it's a political endeavor, is it really a thing that you can ask whether it's got purpose or a purpose or purposes? So I think just sort of wrestling with that definition and what it means to ask that question across different conceptualizations of tertiary is really important. The second point, I think, is way more, it's sort of playing devil's advocate here. And it's really a case of embedded in a lot of the discussion, not here, but in the literature about the purpose or purposes of higher education, further education, tertiary education. There's a certain normativity within it. And a moralistic assumption that essentially if you mention the economy, it's really bad. And you weren't doing that, but I worry that it's kind of embedded in there. And actually what we really need to be doing is moving away from that, I don't know, sort of moral tone around purpose or purposes, actually acknowledge that maybe it doesn't really matter, that what we really need here is a fresh set of narrative tools to talk about multiplicity. And you've illustrated that multiplicity really well, and wherever you are in different parts of the system, you'll view purpose or purposes in different ways, emphasize some more than others. But that's great, but it's not necessarily a problem. And so I guess this is a question. The issue is, just because the policy dimension focuses on the economy, does it really matter? Does it detract from the fact that within institutions, educationalists are going to talk about education, they're going to talk about formation, they're going to talk about knowledge? Why does it really matter that there's multiple dimensions and dynamics? What we really need to do, and I suppose my question is, what's the next step in forming a language that enables us to capture multiplicity without normativity, and maybe celebrate the fact that tertiary education, broadly speaking, is a dynamic space where contestation is important and valuable, and that's what defines it, rather than trying to find a particular set of purposes that represent some people effectively but not others.
Yep, thank you, James. I think that those are really, really important points, and I appreciate the fact that we appreciate the point about the multiplicity, which is also something that we would like to highlight when talking about the tertiary, and the things around moving beyond normative language is also something we're attempting with a little bit with the empirical data analysis, but when talking about purposes for questions like as such, it can be very relevant to the values and normative discussions. Maybe something to unpack later.
I agree that I think the multiplicity is actually it's been one of the main things that we have been discussing, and the thing that we want to show. And I like the idea of presenting the tertiary education system as a space of contestation. But I do think that space of contestation also needs to go to the policy discourse, because policy is also, if it's discussing just one particular way, it's also going to shape the ways in which the institutions are going to act. Like all the literature say that much of the focus on the individual and private benefits of education is what is shaped the funding system, and is the main justification of why fees were implemented. So the way in which policy discuss this is also very important in terms of thinking on the possible changes within the institution. So this shaping or this discursive or productive power of policy, I think, is crucial. So I think and that is probably more than a particular normative message. I think the normative message for me would be trying to expand the discussion also at the level of and the level of policy, and the policy also being in charge and recognizing that this is a political environment in which they need to discuss more terms than just the economic one, not the one that we think, but at least recognizing that there is more than one particular perspective on the discussion of tertiary. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Really interesting talk. I'll do just one very quick comment, not to go back to the quadrant, but the other thing on the quadrant is agency non-economic? Is social equity non-economic? So that's kind of one of those things that I wonder about, that maybe get sucked into kind of a kind of, or seems to get sucked into a framing of values or something. But the other question I have that may have emerged from your interviews is, like, in these discussions, I think a lot of what's going on is that people actually just don't trust higher education institutions. And like the economic discussions that get pulled in are because these are things that we think we can measure concretely and that institutions haven't been delivering on properly. And sometimes the other kind of broader mission, when the institutions are talking about it, we think they're pulling the wool over our eyes. And so fundamentally, like, a large share of people don't believe that these universities are these fundamentally moral, elevated organizations. frankly, I don't believe that they're these fundamentally morally elevated organizations. And think some of these things are people with particular values that may be very elite, historically very elite values, that they want to be agents for. I'm curious how that is reflected, if that was reflected at all in your interviews. Is that tangential to this discussion, or is that a big part of this discussion? I'm really interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think there is something about this distrust on education, and I wouldn't put it just in terms of distrust of in the elite sector, which of course there is a lot of elitization in this discussion, and I totally agree. And with this distance between some kind of institutions, especially universities and some other sectors, but I would describe that there is some part of the tertiary education system that they have this distrust to education in general and the education institutions. So they try to avoid even the word education. So they prefer skills, they prefer training, they prefer any other conceptualization, because the skills bring to them something that they don't trust. And in my particular opinion, I think that is dangerous. I think there is something that we need to defend on the educational system, understood as broad and different types of institutions, and not just the elite and universities. But there is something there. For example, people from apprenticeship, they define and they describe the tertiary education system as the other, as something that they don't belong to. And in our broader understanding of education as any transformative initiative that could happen in any kind of institutions, for us it was more like an apprenticeship should be inside our conceptualization of tertiary, but they trying to deflect from that particular part, and that happens also in other systems, in employers. And so yes, I think there is a distrust on education, but I see it as problematic in general. Yeah.
In our workshops with learners, we've got learners who are enrolled in different educational programs, and some of them were describing the decision not to enter university. Part of the reason is the distrust of the higher education of universities, where they wanted something more tangible and more helpful for their work and life through other programs. But then there are also students enrolled in university and who are saying they really value the experience, they really value the university education, etc. So there are again diverse perspectives, but I agree with you. The issues around distrust is very, very important that we will be able to kind of explore further. Thank you.
Shall we take two comments, questions at the same time? Ellen, and then we move on to Zachary. Ellen, do you want to unmute yourself?
Hi, sorry, I was just going to piggyback on the issue that's been raised. I think it falls on my initial comment. James raised a point about a moral ethos running through it. I'm of a view of, I don't know who the last speaker was, but a lot of this stuff about asserting the public good is actually quite tone deaf to the kinds of wider debate that's going on and concern. And I think that's why I suggested that some of the terms that are used, you might rethink all those things. I also wondered whether or not you have, or maybe you're going to looking at the kind of feedback according to demographic characteristics. I'd be interested in seeing where those different perspectives more come from. I mean, I know you identified by a kind of a role, but that doesn't tell me enough. And another point that you might look at, because I think they're important, are all these surveys that are coming out. Now, they don't quite answer the same questions you're asking, but there's a crossover, and they do raise a lot of those similar types of issues. Certainly the ones that I've seen over the years, and it's not a recent. When I'm talking about surveys that go back, that I looked at it starting in around 2010. So this isn't a new phenomena. this kind of issue around, let's call it, it was higher education. Now we're using the term tertiary. And there's some ellipsis in the way in which you describe some of the stuff, so it's not quite clear. But yeah, I think that's worth looking at. Those other perspectives that feed into or also crisscross around that data you're getting from the qualitative.
We invite Zachary and Lynn. Zachary, do you want to unmute yourself and
Yeah, colleagues, thanks again so much for having me along for this. This was great. I think my note just sort of, well, it parallels or emphasizes what Professor Hazelcorn and James et al. Have been saying in the meeting. Just this question of the moral and your note on the work of Gert Biesta. I've spent some time in the work of Nell Noddings out of Stanford. And just a curious question from me is really, what do you both sort of hold as the moral, if there is a moral imperative of a university? And if so, what position do you hold on that? You know, and how are we going to express that? I mean, a lot of the colleagues in the room are raising this, and I know that, you know, for example, Taper and Salter have written extensively at Oxford about sort of the shifts in policy and planning and practice, particularly around higher education. Malcolm Titus talked about, Harold Silver has talked about the move from, you know, higher education to post-compulsory education to now tertiary education. And we try to be all things to all people and end up being nothing to ourselves. And so I wonder what sort of your moral certitude is about what the university's place is as a member of the social infrastructure of society. Thanks.
thank you both.
Thanks, Zach, for your question. I think personally, I think for me it's very important, and an important part of our project, but personally is trying to broaden the discussion on purposes and aims of higher education, and trying to bring and relying more in the work of Paul Ashwin and others, like trying to bring the educational aims to the discussion more explicitly, and understanding education in a very broad perspective as any initiative that has a transformative aim or purpose, and that of course could be, and I'm thinking on the entire tertiary education system and not just in the university, but that transformative endeavor should of course reflect the different part of the sector. So in some cases it's going to be more related with the skills, you know, some other is going to be related with knowledge, but I think we need to discuss the educational system in terms that are not just reductive to one particular contribution, which I do think is important. Economic growth, it is an important contribution, but I think our project is also trying to broaden the particular discussion and recognize that transformative process.
Thank you. So for me, I also hold the view that the purposes of tertiary education, higher education, further education, etc., should not be narrowed and should not be just one single set of principle or ideas. I acknowledge that the diversity of views, but also diversity of the experiences and conditions that people live with. And also for me, it's important that the tertiary education institutions are not disconnected. So it's important that they connect with the public, with the society in which those institutions operate. So some parts of the distrust came from the distance between the tertiary education and the populations and the public and the communities, which is an issue that I myself am seeing. It's a really important and valuable question. Thank you for asking that, because we as researchers, we also hold certain kinds of positionality and certain types of values, and it is helpful to reflect upon them when we are writing those papers. And for Alan's question, thank you so much, Alan. So we'll definitely refer to the other research and the surveys which have maybe wider range of coverage and reach. In terms of the question around the interviewees' backgrounds,
Yeah.
I'm afraid we don't have the data that we can report. We have the information about their roles, but not other types of personal information that we can kind of report for this. But thank you. That's a really good reminder as well, maybe for future research, or it will be helpful to consider. Yeah.
Okay, I guess we don't have any more questions. Thank you, Xing and Gonzalo again, and thank everyone online. I'm just gonna very quickly about the following seminar series. And so today's recording would be made available on our SKOPE YouTube channels, and also the slides will be shared on our the SKOPE website. And we have I think there's two seminar series seminars left, and we also have a book launch on Monday and two events with Professor Ellen Bowen next week, and we hope to see you again soon. Okay, thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay, I wasn't.